Welcome to the Music for the Soul podcast, where we talk honestly about difficult things. This is a place where music, hope, and healing come together. I'm Becky Nordquist.
And I'm Steve Seiler. One of the joys of making music in Nashville is that we have as fine of musicians in that city as you will find anywhere in the world. And we are honored and delighted to have one of those with us today. Welcome, Scott Williamson, to the podcast.
How you guys doing?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
Well, I am great. I'm sitting here in my studio feeling like we're back in the pandemic. This is crazy doing this techno thing.
Yes, it's especially crazy doing a techno thing with me at the helm. That's you're flying without a net at that point. But we're sterling conversationalists, so it makes up for it, right, Becky?
I think we're fun. I don't know.
Okay, fun. I'll go with fun. I wanted to start from the now it can be told category because, Scott, I don't think I've ever told you this. I originally wanted to be a drummer. I was watching the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, and I told my dad, I want a drum set. And then I got to thinking about it overnight. I thought, now, wait a minute. Ringo's in the back. I want to be one of the guys in the front. So I went back to my dad and said, no, scratch that. I don't want to be a drummer. I want to be a guitar player. This is how frivolously this life decision was made. So how old were you when you started playing the drums, and what got you interested?
Well, I was 9. First of all, I think you made the wise decision going in a different direction. But I was not, I was interested. My mother said that I would, she remembers me in diapers standing in front of the TV watching the Sonny and Cher show and Lawrence and Welk and dancing around, always beating on stuff. So probably from the time I was 2 or 3, my first memories of wanting to be a drummer were, my dad was a professional, he was a music minister and a studio musician. And I would go to the studio with him and watch recording sessions with rhythm sections. That was an eye opener for me. That really got me interested. Before I had a drum set, I would just find anything in the house. This is probably most drummers' development story. I would just set up anything that would mimic a drum kit and bang on it. And finally, my dad really thought I had the armature to be a trumpet player. And a lot of his professional friends thought so too. And he was really encouraging that until one of his drummer friends heard me sit down at a real drum set. And I think that friend of his who was a professional recording musician in Los Angeles, where I grew up, he kind of went over to my dad and said, Dave, I think you've got a drummer here. So that was the start.
Wow. I mean, my hat is always off to the drummers because that many appendages flying all at the same time. I'm constantly in awe.
Well, and it's funny, you would think that coordination would make you coordinated in every way. It does not. I'm a horrible athlete. I can barely, rub my tummy and pat my head at the same time. So all coordination is relative, I guess.
Wow. I'm really surprised to hear that.
Yeah.
So I'm curious then, does the ability to play different rhythms with different appendages come naturally to a gifted drummer, or is that something you have to study and learn how to do to separate those out?
I think it's both. There is anything that somebody's good at, whether it's math or athletics or music, whatever it happens to be. There has to be some nature in there, but there's a lot of nurture too. You can't rely solely on what comes naturally. So yes, the coordination came naturally, but my teachers and my mentors were quite good at putting things in front of me that required me to work for it, polyrhythms and things like that, which I never studied real deeply, but it was enough to make me realize that I can't just phone it in on my basic talent. There is a certain element of elbow grease that you have to put in, as you know.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of elbow grease, how much practicing did you do as a youngster?
I played all the time, rarely what I was supposed to be practicing. I knew early that I wanted to be a studio musician. And so, typical kid, you always feel like what people are telling you to do is a waste of time and you should do just what you want to do. But I did a lot of studying. It just wasn't what my mentors thought I should be doing. I would listen to records all the time. I would put on headphones and play to those records. to my favorite musicians, whether it was a rock band or some pop record that was populated mostly by studio musicians. I was memorizing what they did and trying to assimilate it and make it my own. So always playing, but when it came to sitting down and practicing rudiments and displacement and music theory, that stuff I had to be a little more disciplined with. And I think to the chagrin of most of my teachers, I didn't do a great job at all that. So
the thing that I can relate to in that is that I learned songwriting from listening to great songs.
of course.
I didn't go to school for that. I just listened, and mimicked at first.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
But like you said earlier, I can listen back to when I was 10 years old. The gift for melody was kind of already there.
Yeah.
The lyric thing took 20 years, but the melody thing was there.
Well, everybody knows the old cliche: good artists imitate, great artists steal. And that sounds bad on the surface, but essentially what it means is we are all sort of the sum total of our influences. And even if I can copy my favorite drummer on some song, if I can learn exactly what he played, eventually it becomes my own. It's not ever going to be exactly what he or she played because it's coming from me. So there's an extent to which eventually it becomes something you do, and then you assimilate whatever that thing is into something that might have been your idea. It all kind of works out in the wash.
So while we're on the topic of artists that you listen to, what are some of your favorite artists that you listen to, or people that inspire you or have inspired you?
Evie Turnquist. Sorry, that's a little inside joke. Surely you guys know who that are. Steve's got to be.
Oh,
okay.
Oh, dear, that is who I used to mimic, standing on the fireplace mantle. Yes, with my pretend microphone.
Wow. Yeah. If you know Evie is, you have to be of a certain age, as they say.
All right.
No,
now be careful.
I've got tons of influences. Steve and I are both Toto fans. They were a huge band back in the 80s and 90s, and they still tour. They're a band that was made up of studio musicians, which made them somewhat unique. And there was a particular drum part that came out in the early 80s from Toto's drummer called, his name was Jeff Porcaro. And the drum beat is from the song Rosanna. And for years, it was Drummer 101. If you couldn't play that beat, you weren't a real drummer. So they were a huge influence. But I grew up listening to everything. Again, my dad, being a studio musician, I was exposed to all different styles. He taught me that if I wanted to be a successful session musician, I would have to be good at playing different things. So I listened to everything from deep John Coltrane, Miles Davis kind of jazz to, the pop music of the 40s and 50s, which was big band, to rock and roll of all vintages. I am one of the people who discovered the Beatles later in life. Which is odd, but I realized the genius there probably not until my 20s. And then I listened growing up to all kinds of Christian music. So I had all of that as well, everything from Sandy Patty to Petra to Whiteheart to Stephen Curtis Chapman to Michael W. I mean, all of it was in there. And it just kind of all, like I said before, it all kind of turns into this soup, and you just develop a musical vocabulary from listening to all of this stuff. I love classical music as well. I don't know, James Taylor, John Mayer, all of these people, Fleetwood Mac, they're one of my deserted island bands. So there's a lot of stuff in there swimming around.
Yeah, and it all becomes part of the toolkit as you absorb all those different styles so that you can draw from a lot of different places. And as a studio musician, that's got to be invaluable because you never know what somebody's going to set in front of you.
That's right. There are a few things that if somebody calls me, for instance, if someone calls me and says, we're going to do, I know this sounds funny, but it actually has happened. This is kind of speed metal. I will just say, look, I know two guys in town who will kill that. And I'm not one of them. Here's their number. But more often than not, if something is put in front of me, I want to play it believably. I tried to get where I feel pretty comfortable with about 80% of what's possible.
So say, you're in the studio and somebody puts a chord chart down in front of you. How do you decide what you're going to play?
Well, these days, and it has become more and more this way since the advent of pop music, There are basically beats A, B, C, D, and E for a drummer. There might be an F in there somewhere, but there aren't a ton of options. It kind of, drums are a certain thing. There are certain beats that work really well in the pop world. And so it's usually not a huge mystery. Occasionally, I'll get with a producer who is more adventurous and wants to experiment with as many ideas as possible, turning beats around or just trying to come up with something that nobody's ever done before. But more often than not, you listen to a song demo and the song kind of tells you what you need to do. And each instrumentalist is proficient enough at their instrument to kind of know at least where to go for the foundational layer. And then you can build from there. If you've got an opinionated producer, he can say, this is all great. Let's change this, this, and this. And if you're more in a situation where you're policing yourself, you just do that yourself. But it's really not maybe as complicated as it seems.
Curious, though, for the musician who might be listening and has never even thought about being a studio musician, they play in a band or whatever, what would you say is the fundamental difference between pursuing music as an artist, as a part of a band, versus pursuing a studio career?
Well, I immediately think of two primary differences. One is that as a studio musician, you are doing other people's material. Now, that doesn't mean that you have no creative input into it. I've been on sessions where the players that were hired have brought so much to the song that they, in some cases, probably should have been given writer credit. Mm-hmm. But by and large, what you're doing is serving somebody else's material. That's the first thing. The other thing, and I'm sure you, having been around this so much, Steve, you could probably add to this. The other thing that I immediately think of is when I'm playing something in a live context, a 2-hour show requires way more stamina from me than playing in the studio, where I'm usually never playing for more than 5 minutes at a time without some sort of a break. Now, we may play the same song 10 times before we get the take. That doesn't happen often, but it does happen sometimes. And that can be kind of emotionally or intellectually taxing to keep coming back to the same thing. But it's not real unless it's a really fast song, that just requires a ton of teenage testosterone brawn. Usually playing in the studio is not very physically exhausting, but the older I'm getting, boy, playing a 2-hour show, that takes it out of you. So what do you think? What are the other differences that maybe there are?
I think the one difference that you bring up about having to play something over and over and over again is really key, because I'm reminded of a session when I was a teenager. I got to visit and watch Bones Howe work a session.
Oh, wow.
And he had Hal Blaine on the drums. Okay. So
you got to watch Hal Blaine on a session?
Yeah.
Wow.
I know it's not fair. I know. So there's this one song, and I remember that they got up to like the 34th or 5th take of this song. And one of the people in the room, I guess the artist manager or somebody, wanted them to go to lunch, wanted them to break, felt like they were getting tired of it and they needed to come back. And Bones was like, no, they're so close to it. They're so close to it. We got to get it now. And I did go to a number of sessions where I saw producers take a break and then have the players come back, and they never got back to to that magic that they were capturing. Yeah. So that's part of the studio thing, is how do you keep the creativity fresh? How do you keep coming at it like you've never heard it or played it before? That's not a live thing at all, because every live show is different, right? And even though you've played those songs a zillion times, the audience is different, the lighting is different, the staging is different, all that. So I think, to me, that you really highlighted a key thing is being able to bring that fresh energy to every take.
Well, and you're playing basically to an audience of just a few people. The producer and or the artist and your own instincts, maybe the other players, they're the only ones giving you feedback in this scenario. So there's a certain level of confidence and understand, I know what I'm doing. I have been in situations where I felt, boy, I'm not sure I'm delivering today. Is anybody okay with any of this? There's a lot of really important psychology that goes on in the studio.
Right. Speaking of the studio, I'm just curious, do you have any idea how many songs of Music for the Souls that you have played on?
I have no idea. It's got to be at least 15 or 20, I would think, maybe more.
Maybe more is the correct answer. 27.
Oh gosh. Remind me how far back this goes. When did we start?
The first Music for the Soul release was in 2003, but I think you would have played for the first time with us in 2005.
Wow.
I'm just pulling that out of my hat, but I think that would be correct.
Wow. So we're going back almost 20 years here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I can just say that you have played on a song of Becky's that I know is one of her favorites. Are you aware of that, Becky? Scott played on Heaven's Playground.
I was aware of that, and it is a very special song. So thank you so much for your giftedness on that piece. That's very dear to my own heart.
Well, you're very kind, but Steve comes into those sessions with so much love for the material and so much good direction about what needs to happen that it would be shocking if any one of the players on those recording sessions didn't show up with their A game. I guess it's possible, but I've never seen it happen, and I wouldn't ever expect it.
Well, thank you, Scott. It's nice of you to say that. What you haven't told the people, though, is that I show up with mortally wounded charts, and that you often rewrite them on the spot.
No, that is a very common thing. I've been known when I'm producing to show up with charts that need help, and so I know the feeling.
Well, at Music for the Soul, we're all about transparency, so this is good for the soul.
Amen.
Well, since we're talking about Music for the Soul recordings, I want to play a little bit of something here real quick, and then we'll continue our conversation. Okay, so that is the track to a song called Ambush, which was on our Grief CD, Drink Deep. And I just loved the nuance that you brought to that track. And so that's why I played a version with no vocal. I didn't want the vocal to step all over the drum part.
Now there's love for the drummer right there.
There you go. Well, Scott, you bring such an attitude of service to the sessions that I've been a part of with you. Is that an outgrowth of your faith, or the example that your father set?
Well, first of all, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I'm also known to be a bit acerbic and sarcastic in situations. And I know that it makes people laugh sometimes, but there are moments where it's like, you ever feel like you're going to say something and you can't stop it from coming out, and you wish that you could. So I'm happy to know that it's not all that. Thank you for saying it. The answer to your question is yes, both. My mom and I are the very uber vocal, opinionated people in the family, which isn't to say my dad was without opinions. He was not, but he was very, very diplomatic in the way that he would communicate, even hard things. Like, he had a gift for being able to really, if you'll pardon the term, he could tear you a new one, and you would still walk out of the room feeling edified. Like, you knew he loved you, that he wouldn't bother to have this conversation if he didn't care about you and the situation. So that is not something I had to learn that, and I'm still learning it. I got plenty of my dad, but that teddy bear thing was unique to him. But so much of who he was, who my mother is an outgrowth of our devout faith. And I'm both riveted and propped up by my faith, but also challenged and in some cases convicted by how badly I fail in some of those areas. I wish that I was a better spokesperson for my faith than I often am. But yeah, the short answer to your question is yes, both of those things are huge.
Well, you mentioned having been a producer as well. Can you break down for the layperson what a producer does?
The easiest way to describe it, I think, is to say maybe the producer is to making records, making music, what a director is to making movies. And I'm sure people have probably heard that analogy before. each producer approaches things, in his own unique way. But essentially, you're overseeing the process of recording a piece of music or an entire project. You oversee it from its inception to its completion. You're there to serve the artist at the end of the day, but you're also there to people who live in the recording studio and make their living there have an understanding of things that go on in the recording studio that even some artists, not all, but some artists don't. They live out in the performing world. And so the areas of expertise have to sort of come together. And so the producer is there to try and steer the artist in all of the right directions and steer him or her away from all the wrong directions. Mm. Sometimes there's tension there because what's the old, if two people in a room are both in full agreement, then one of them isn't necessary. Mm. I don't know if that's always true, but it's an interesting statement. And I think sometimes a friendly amount of adversarial tension in the studio can actually be helpful. I don't always love it while it's happening, but sometimes you end up with a better product because, again, it just means everybody, it really, really is invested and cares what happens. So some producers are involved, like very, very micromanagement, every piece of the process they want to be very involved in. Other producers, at the far end of the spectrum, other end of the spectrum, you might find producers who essentially see their role strictly as overseers. They cast the project and step away and let people do what they do. And so there's everything from that hyper micromanagement to what I just described and everything in between. Mm. I think that the people that have worked with me would probably describe me as something in between, but you'd have to ask them. There are some things that I get real obsessed with and I want to micromanage, and other stuff that I realize that I should just let everybody else do what they do. So
I have a question that's a little off the production, but I wondered, how important is it that a drummer plays another instrument or understand music from a rhythm perspective?
When I am clinicking young people who want to get into this business, I always tell them, do not play the drums, don't play the guitar, don't play whatever your instrument is, don't play that. Play the song. The song has to dictate who you are, what you're doing. And one of the ways that you can improve your musicianship to sort of get to that understanding is to play at least one instrument other than your primary. My dad really understood that and made me, much to my chagrin. I took piano lessons. I'm really glad that I did. I'm not a great keyboard player, but since I have gone through phases of my professional life where I've needed to arrange or to be in some way involved in the bigger process of music other than just drumming, having some of that harmonic understanding has been really helpful for me. But you really do. You have to understand, even if you're working in a situation where you don't particularly like the music you're working on, you are still there to serve the artist and the song that they've written. And the fact that you don't like it doesn't always mean that it's not good. There have been several times where I've been in a situation thinking this is not great, and I hear it finish and I'm like, boy, I was wrong. I just couldn't see it while I was there. And if you always go into every situation understanding I have to find a way to serve the song, you're much more likely to deliver something that could actually make it, great in the final analysis. And expanding your musical vocabulary by, understanding other instrumentation is a great way to do that.
I've always said that learning the piano for me, because I started on guitar and I didn't take the piano up for 10 years, but it's like the whole orchestra is laid out in front of you,
Yeah.
and you can just look at it, you can see it, and all the notes are available. And it really helped me, like you said, with arranging, production, with all of it, to understand a little bit more of what was going on. So,
Yep.
So you've talked a lot about serving the artist and the song, and I love that. I'm wondering who maybe some of your favorite artists are that you worked with.
Oh, all of them. I love all of them.
Okay, give me just like a couple of top ones, can you?
Well, it's so funny. Part of the problem is that I can hardly remember what I did last week. So, I'll hear something 10 years later and somebody will say that's you. And you can sort of tell it's you playing, but yeah, you have no memory of having been there. For instance, if somebody said, what's your favorite project you ever got to play on? This is going way back to early in my career and probably all of our careers, but I got to play on a record for a band called DC Talk, 28 years ago now, called Jesus Freak. That record was chased and mimicked for 15, 20 years after it was made. It was, for a season, it was seen as sort of the high bar in Christian music to which we all need to reach. So I loved working with them, the magic of being in the studio with Mark Heimerman and Toby Mac at the same time. It was a lot of work, but the results were great. I've loved working with so many people. I got to work with Reba McEntire one time, and she was absolutely delightful. Amy Grant is absolutely delightful. I've gotten to work with Michael W. Smith, and I recently got to play on one song for Blake Shelton years ago, but I recently worked on something where I got to know him a little bit better because he was producing, and he was delightful. There are just so many people that I could try and go backwards and think of, but the almost everybody that I've ever worked with, there's been something about them that was just incredibly delightful. One of the big shocks of my life, I got to play on an Alice Cooper record about 12 years ago, and he was delightful. I mean, absolutely nothing like the character he plays. As a matter of fact, he's a believer. His dad was a pastor. Alice is basically a Calvinist he's a scratch golfer who played with R.C. Sproul. I mean, talk about the, and he could not have been sweeter. So, you guys have all the same kind of stories. You meet some of these people and you're just stunned at how kind and down to earth they are. Of course, there are divas, but I've been fortunate. And even some of the divas are awesome. You get to know them and you find out, we're all just people.
Yes.
You know what I love about all that list that you just kind of rattled off is just the differences between all of those artists and genres. And, I think artists that are just up and coming, they paint with such a thin brush, and they just need to consider using that wide brush of learning all those different styles and having kind of that really eclectic listening ear for music. And I just love that broad aspect that you just mentioned of all those different people.
It has been quite a ride getting to work in all those different genres.
Well, speaking of quite a ride, I wondered if you could tell us about the time you flew your plane upside down.
I don't ever remember flying it upside down. Did I lie to you about something?
This is a story that I heard from Kent Hooper, that you got caught in the jet stream of another aircraft and wound up.
I know what he wasn't with me I got my pilot's license 20 years ago this year. I have no skills other than music, and I wanted to learn something new. So I learned to fly, and it is a drug. It's crazy how delightful it is. But yeah, when I was learning, there have actually been movies made about a couple of famous air disasters that happened because of something called wake turbulence. The wingtips of a plane in front of you puts out sort of like a wake behind a boat. And depending on the shape of the plane's wing and the size of the plane, it might be significant. And I was in a tiny little 2-seater training aircraft over at one of Nashville's satellite airports. And there was a 727 in the pattern, which means he was flying circuits around the airport to practice his landings. That is not common for a jet, a passenger size jet plane to be in the pattern at a small airport, but he was doing it. And I was by myself before I had my license, but you do some solo flight before you get your license to sort of get used to the feel of it. I was over there practicing landings. You are taught to stay above when you're on a landing and you're behind somebody, stay above them, land past them so that you don't get caught in their wake. And I just misjudged it. And I remember the plane jerking to the right so hard that I had no control. I remember looking at a grass patch at the end of the runway, thinking, this is where I die. I will be a hole in the ground right at that grass patch. And at the last minute, I was able to kind of wrest control of the plane. I got out of the wake. I've had a couple other scares like that in my 20 years of flying, but none that got my attention maybe quite that. That was an adventure.
I'll
Well,
say, goodness, I was envisioning this, Tom Cruise moment, where they fly upside down when he was saying that. I'm like, no, this is very scary. I'm
It
so
was.
glad you were okay.
It's terrifying, and hopefully I'll never make that mistake again. So,
Mm. Well, we're glad you're here.
great. Thanks.
well, before we wrap up, I just want to know, are there any music projects that you're working on now that you would like anybody to know about?
Well, I've just finished for anybody that happens to listen to Southern gospel, that's a genre that is very specific, and the people that listen to it are loyalists. I just got to finish. I played on and mixed the new Gaither vocal band record and a record for an artist and studio musician called Gordon Mote. Both of these records I'm really proud of.
Well, why don't we have people keep track of you on Facebook and Instagram? And
Do it. You can find me there. My 17-year-old son and I are trying a YouTube channel. If you go on YouTube, there's pilot videos all over the place because pilots just love to watch other guys fly and do great landings or screw up landings. And it's kind of a silly little, micro community. But hobby pilots like me, we're just looking for somewhere fun to go land and eat. So you try to find, well, I can't find on YouTube very much, if anything, about pilots and food. So my son and I are working on a YouTube channel called Pilot Eats Food. And we're trying to basically do Guy Fieri meets comedians in cars getting coffee with very low production value. So Pilot Eats Food on YouTube.
I can't wait.
Has nothing to do with music other than I'm going to, Steve, if you like flying in small planes, or either one of you, I will take anybody up because it's not funny with one person. You got to get into conversation about anything. And I'm just trying to keep it all relatively positive and politics free, which is hard for me, but I'm doing it anyway. So
sounds great. Shortly after recording this episode, Scott shared that his wife, Vanessa, has had a recurrence of cancer. We know you are a praying audience. Please remember Vanessa and Scott and their family in your prayers during this challenging season. Thank you.